He let them call him a liar, and still dropped his gun, the old man would say years later. But on that day the sun hung low over Red Hollow, and dust moved like slow smoke between boots as Ethan Cole stood in the center of the square, quiet as a fence post, while Lila Greyhawk's voice cut across the silence sharp and certain, calling him something no man in that town had ever dared say to his face. He didn't answer, didn't even blink, just reached down with steady hands and unfastened the worn leather holster from his hip, the metal of the buckle catching a thin line of light before it fell, soft but final, into the dirt at his feet. And that was the moment everything shifted, because men out here knew what a gun meant, knew what it said about survival and choice, and giving it up in front of a crowd like that wasn't surrender. It was something else, something harder to understand. A horse snorted somewhere behind the saloon. Leather creaked. A boot scraped half an inch backward. Small sounds that filled the space where words should have been. And still Ethan said nothing, his hat casting a shadow over eyes that watched but never challenged. While Lila stood 10 feet away, shoulders squared, jaw tight, the wind tugging at a loose strand of her dark hair, as if even it was unsure whether to stay or run. She had expected anger, maybe denial, maybe a hand drifting toward steel, but not this. Not a man who chose stillness when every rule of the frontier demanded reaction. And for a second, just one, something flickered behind her certainty. Around them, the town gathered itself into judgment. Men who had seen too many hard seasons, women who had buried more than they spoke of, all of them waiting for a story to land clean and simple, good or bad, truth or lie, because out here there was no room for anything in between. The sheriff shifted his weight, fingers brushing the edge of his belt like he might speak. But the words didn't come, not yet, because even he felt it now, that strange pressure settling in the air, like the moment before a storm when everything holds its breath. Ethan's gaze moved once, slow, not toward Lila but past her, toward the distant line of hills, where the land dipped and rose again, as if whatever answer lived there mattered more than anything said in this square, and that only made the silence heavier. A child near the general store leaned forward, wide-eyed, sensing something he couldn't name, while an older man muttered under his breath, trying to force the world back into something that made sense. But sense was slipping, piece by piece, because the man they thought they knew wasn't playing the part they'd written for him. He just stood there, hands empty, shoulders relaxed, waiting, not for forgiveness, not for mercy, but for something else entirely, something that hadn't arrived yet. And the longer he waited, the more the questions spread through the crowd like dry grass catching a spark. If he was lying, why wasn't he fighting to be believed? The sheriff finally cleared his throat, the sound dry as old wood. But even that small noise seemed to fade before it reached the center where Ethan Cole stood, unmoving, while Lila Greyhawk kept her eyes locked on him, as if looking away might let something slip through her grasp. She had waited for this moment since sunrise, had followed every rumor, every whispered trail that led to his name, and yet now that she stood 10 feet away, with the whole town behind her, something refused to settle. The way it should. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of horses and dust, and with it came memory, uninvited and sharp, the image of a figure moving in the dark beyond the ridge, the sound of footsteps that did not belong to a man standing calmly in daylight. She tightened her jaw, pushing it aside, because doubt had no place here, not in front of people who already watched her like they were waiting to see if she would stand or falter. Ethan did not move, but his eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, flickered once toward her, not defensive, not pleading, just present, as if he already knew the weight she carried and chose not to touch it. That look unsettled her more than any argument could have, because it did not fight back, and without a fight, her certainty had nothing to push against. Behind her, someone shifted, then another, the crowd beginning to murmur again, low and uncertain, like cattle sensing a storm they could not see. The sheriff took a step forward this time, slower, careful, his voice finding its way at last as he said that there would be order, that there would be answers, but the words felt thinner than they should, stretched over something deeper that none of them could name. Lila lifted her chin, forcing her voice steady as she spoke again, repeating what she had seen, what she believed, each word placed like a stone meant to hold firm. And still Ethan said nothing, not even when the accusation settled fully between them. He simply stood there, breathing slow, shoulders loose, as if time moved differently around him, as if he was not waiting for judgment, but for something else entirely, something that had not yet stepped into the light. A boy near the edge of the square shifted his weight, eyes darting between Lila and the hills beyond. His small hands clenched at his sides as though holding onto something too heavy to carry. And for a moment he looked like he might step forward, might speak, but fear held him where he stood. Lila saw him, just for a second, and something in her chest tightened, a quiet warning she did not want to hear, because if there was more to the story, if the truth was not as clean as she needed it to be, then everything she had built since that morning would begin to crack. She forced her gaze back to Ethan, searching for anything that would confirm what she had already decided, but all she found was stillness, patient and unyielding, and that patience began to feel like a question hanging in the air, one no one in Red Hollow was ready to answer yet. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over Red Hollow like a weight no one could shrug off. And in that stillness the smallest movement began to matter. The way Lila Greyhawk's fingers curled slightly at her side. The way Ethan Cole shifted his weight just enough to keep his balance in the dust. The way the boy near the edge of the square took one half step forward before stopping again, as if the ground itself warned him to stay back. The sheriff noticed it too, that flicker of motion, and his eyes followed. The boy, narrowing, sensing that whatever truth lingered here was not standing in the center, but trembling at the edges. Ethan saw it as well, though he did not turn his head, only a slight change in his gaze, a quiet acknowledgement, as if he had been waiting for that moment longer than anyone else. Lila felt it before she understood it, that shift in attention, and her breath caught just slightly, enough to remind her that this was no longer as simple as she had told herself it would be. The boy's boots scraped softly against the packed earth as he moved again, one careful step, then another, each one slower than the last, like he was walking into a place he could not leave once he arrived. No one stopped him, not yet, because no one knew what he carried, only that it was heavy enough to bend his shoulders and pull his eyes downward. Lila watched him now, fully, her focus slipping from Ethan for the first time, and something uneasy began to rise in her chest. Not fear, not quite, but the sense that a door she had closed was about to open again, whether she wanted it to or not. The boy finally reached the edge of the open space, close enough that the dust kicked by his steps drifted into the still air between them, and he hesitated, looking at Ethan, then at Lila, then back toward the distant hills, as if asking permission from something far beyond this town. Ethan remained still, but there was something in the way he stood, a quiet steadiness that did not push, did not demand, only waited, and that waiting gave the boy just enough courage to lift his chin. When he spoke, his voice was thin at first, almost lost to the wind, but it carried farther than anyone expected, reaching the ears that needed it most. And in that moment the shape of the story began to change, not loudly, not all at once, but like a shadow shifting with the sun, revealing edges that had been hidden before. Lila felt it in her bones before the words fully formed, that what was coming would not fit the certainty she had held on to since morning, and for the first time she did not speak, did not interrupt, because something in Ethan's silence had already done. That for her, had carved out a space where the truth could finally stand on its own, and the longer it stood there, the harder it became to ignore. The boy swallowed hard, the sound small but sharp in the quiet, and when he finally spoke again his voice carried clearer, steadier, like he had crossed a line inside himself that he could not step back from, and every eye in Red Hollow turned toward him now, not because they trusted him yet, but because Ethan Cole still had not said a word. The boy pointed, not at Ethan, not at Lila, but toward the ridge beyond the town where the land dipped into shadow, and he said he had seen what happened, had been closer than anyone knew, close enough to hear voices carried by the wind, close enough to recognize one of them even in the dark. Lila's breath tightened in her chest, her fingers stiffening as she followed the direction of his hand, her mind already resisting what her eyes could not see, because the hills held too many memories, too many paths that led back to things she had buried. The boy kept talking, each word careful, as if placing stones across a river he was afraid to fall into. And he said the man they were looking for had not stood still in the open, had not waited in silence, had moved quickly, leaving the ridge before dawn, and Ethan had been there only after, arriving alone, too late to change what had already been done. A murmur rippled through the crowd, uncertain now, no longer sharp but frayed at the edges, and the sheriff stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he tried to piece together something that would hold. Lila shook her head once, slow, almost unnoticeable, as if denying the shape of the words before they could settle, because if Ethan had arrived after, then the timeline she had built would not stand, and if that broke, then everything else might follow. Ethan remained where he was, still as before, but now his stillness carried something else, not just patience, but a quiet acceptance, like a man who had already made peace with how this would unfold. The boy hesitated then, his gaze dropping to the ground, and for a moment it seemed like he might stop, might let the silence swallow the rest, but something stronger held him there, something that would not let him turn away, and when he lifted his head again his eyes flicked toward Lila, just for a second, long enough to say what he could not yet speak aloud. She saw it, and in that brief glance the unease inside her grew sharper, more defined, because she recognized that look, the weight behind it, the way truth sometimes came wrapped in something painful. The wind moved again, carrying dust across the square, soft against boots and hems, and in that shifting haze the distance between what was believed and what was real began to narrow, not with force, not with confrontation, but with something quieter, something that asked for listening instead of judgment. And for the first time since the accusation had been spoken, Lila did not step forward, did not press the claim, because the ground beneath it no longer felt as certain as it had just moments before. The boy's words did not end, they slowed, as if each one weighed more than the last. And when he spoke again he no longer looked at the ground but straight at Lila Greyhawk, his voice steadier now, carried by something that felt older than fear, and he said the man on the ridge had called out a name before he left, not loudly, not in anger, but like someone who expected to be heard, and that name had not been Ethan's. The sound of it seemed to hang in the air even before he spoke it, like the town itself knew what was coming and wished it did not have to be said. Lila's shoulders stiffened, her breath catching just enough to betray her, because somewhere deep inside she already knew which name could break everything open. The boy said it then, clear and unmistakable, and though it was just a name, simple and familiar, it carried a weight that bent the silence around it. Because it belonged to someone Lila had not allowed herself to think about since dawn, the crowd shifted. Confusion spreading now, no longer directed at Ethan but turning inward, searching faces, memories, anything that could make sense of what they had just heard. The sheriff glanced between them, his certainty slipping as he tried to hold on to order, but order had already begun to drift away like dust in the wind. Ethan did not move, but there was a quiet change in the way he stood, as if something long held back had finally reached the surface without needing to be spoken. Lila shook her head once, sharper this time, as if she could push the truth back into silence, but it did not move. It stayed where it was, between her and the boy, between her and Ethan, waiting. The boy took one more step forward, his small boots pressing into the earth with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. And he said Ethan had seen him there, had looked at him, had known he was watching, and still had said nothing, had turned away instead, leaving the ridge without calling out, without bringing anyone back. And for a moment that sounded like guilt, like proof of something hidden. But the boy's voice did not carry accusation. It carried something else, something closer to understanding. He said Ethan had looked toward the path that led east, the one that wound through the rocks and disappeared beyond the hills. And that look had not been fear, it had been choice. Lila felt that word settle into her chest harder than anything before it, because choice meant intent, and intent meant there was something she had not seen, something she had refused to see. The wind shifted again, brushing against her face, and for a second she remembered a different morning, a different voice, one she had trusted without question, and the memory did not fit with what stood in front of her now. Behind her, the town no longer pressed forward, no longer demanded answers, because the answers had begun to turn, slowly, away from the man they had been ready to judge and towards something far more complicated. Lila's gaze moved back to Ethan, really looking at him now, not as a suspect, not as an answer, but as a question she had not been willing to ask. And in that moment she understood the weight of his silence, not as defiance, but as protection, and that understanding did not bring relief. It brought something heavier, something that made her hands feel uncertain at her sides, because if he had chosen silence for a reason, then speaking the truth now would not just change the story, it would change who had to carry it. The name did not fade. It stayed there, heavy and undeniable, and for a long moment no one in Red Hollow knew where to look, because the truth had shifted away from the man standing unarmed in the center and settled somewhere far more difficult to face. Lila Greyhawk felt it settle inside her chest like a stone, pressing against everything she had held certain since morning, and the memory she had tried to keep buried rose without permission. The sound of a familiar voice carried by the wind. The shape of a figure she had refused to see clearly in the dark. Her fingers curled tighter at her sides, not in anger now, but in resistance, because accepting what the boy had said meant unraveling something she had built her strength around. Ethan Cole remained still, but there was a quiet weariness in the way he stood now, not from fear, not from the crowd, but from the weight of something he had chosen to carry alone. The sheriff took another step forward, slower this time, his authority, uncertain as he looked between Lila and the boy, then finally at Ethan, as if hoping the man would speak, would offer something to steady the ground beneath them. But Ethan did not move, did not explain, because whatever truth lived here was not his to give. The boy drew in a breath, his small chest rising and falling as he found the courage to continue, and he said that when Ethan had seen him on the ridge, he had not called out, not because he was hiding, but because he understood what speaking would do, who it would bring into the light. The crowd listened now, truly listened, the earlier tension replaced by something quieter, heavier, a realization that the story they had been ready to believe might have been too simple for the truth it tried to hold. Lila's gaze dropped for just a second, enough to break the line she had held with Ethan, and in that moment the image returned clearer than before. The path leading east through the rocks, the sound of footsteps she had known, but refused to name, and the silence that followed when she had chosen not to follow. She lifted her head again, but the certainty was gone now, replaced by something fragile, something that could not stand under the weight of what she was beginning to understand. Ethan shifted slightly then, not to step away, not to reach for anything, but just enough to ease the dust beneath his boots, and that small movement carried more meaning than any words he could have spoken, because it showed he was still here, still willing to stand in whatever judgment came. Even now, the sheriff exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost to the wind, and the town seemed to follow. A collective breath released as the focus turned, not sharply, not with accusation, but with a quiet, reluctant awareness that the truth was no longer pointing in the same direction. Lila felt it most of all, that turning, that shift, and it left her standing at the center of something she had not expected to carry. Because if Ethan had chosen silence to protect what she was now forced to see, then the next words would not come from him. They would have to come from her. And for the first time since she had spoken that accusation, she did not know if she had the strength to say them. Lila did not speak right away, and that silence said more than anything she could have forced into words, because for the first time the weight of the moment did not belong to Ethan Cole. It belonged to her, and everyone in Red Hollow could feel it shifting, settling, waiting. Her eyes stayed on him, searching, not for guilt now, but for something else, something that might steady her. But Ethan gave nothing except that same quiet presence, the same stillness that had carried him this far. Without a single defense, the wind moved through the square again, brushing dust against boots, tugging lightly at coats, as if the land itself was urging something forward, something that had been held back too long. The sheriff glanced at Lila, then at the boy, then back at Ethan, his voice ready but held in check, because even he understood now that this was no longer his to command. Lila's breath came slower, deeper, as she let the memory rise fully this time, not pushing it away, not reshaping it to fit what she wanted, but seeing it as it had been, the figure on the ridge, the voice, carried low across the rocks, the hesitation she had felt but ignored, and the choice she had made not to follow. Her fingers loosened at her sides, the tension slipping away not into calm, but into something heavier, something that asked more of her than anger ever had. Behind her, the town remained quiet, No longer pressing, no longer certain. Because they were waiting now, not for a verdict, but for truth. And truth had begun to take a different shape. Ethan shifted his gaze once more, not toward her this time, but toward the ground where his holster lay, untouched, as if reminding anyone who noticed that he had given up the one thing that could have changed this moment into something else, something easier, something louder. Lila followed that glance, and for a second the sight of it struck deeper than the accusation she had made, because it was not weakness she saw there, it was restraint, a choice to stand unarmed in front of judgment that was never fully his to carry. The boy stepped back slightly now, his part spoken, his shoulders still heavy but lighter than before, and the space he left behind seemed to open around Lila, placing her at the center of something she could not step away from. She lifted her chin slowly, her voice still not ready to come, because saying the truth would not just clear Ethan, it would bring something else into the light, something tied to her, something she had tried to keep beyond reach. The sheriff shifted again, a quiet impatience beneath his control, but he did not interrupt, because even he knew that forcing the moment would break it. Lila closed her eyes for just a second, the world narrowing to the sound of her own breath and the faint whisper of wind across the open land. And when she opened them again, there was something different there, not certainty, not yet, but the beginning of it, the kind that comes not from what is easy to believe, but from what is hardest to admit. She looked at Ethan once more, and in that look was a question she had not asked before, not out loud, but clear enough in the silence between them, asking not what he had done, but why he had chosen not to speak. And though he did not answer, something in his stillness gave her what she needed, not words, but permission, and that was enough to make her realize that whatever came next would not come from him, it would come from her, and once spoken, it would change everything that followed. Lila's lips parted, but no sound came at first, and that silence stretched long enough for the entire town to feel it, to lean into it without moving, because everyone understood now that whatever she said next would not just answer a question, it would redraw the line between truth and blame. Her gaze drifted past Ethan Cole for a moment, out toward the ridge where the land dipped into shadow, and the memory returned again, clearer than before, the shape of a man she had known her entire life. The weight of his voice carried low by the wind, not angry, not afraid, but certain, and that certainty had been the thing she trusted most, until now. She drew in a breath that felt too sharp in her chest, like it did not belong to her anymore, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, stripped of the edge it once held, as if each word had to pass through something heavier before it could be heard. She said the name again, not as an accusation this time, but as recognition, and the sound of it settled differently, no longer pointed at Ethan, but turned inward, toward a truth she had been standing too close to see. The crowd shifted, not in anger, not in judgment, but in something closer to uncertainty, because the story they had gathered around was changing, and none of them knew what it would become. The sheriff lowered his hand slightly from his belt, his posture easing just enough to show that even he no longer stood on solid ground, and for the first time since the morning began, his eyes left Ethan and rested on Lila. Waiting. Ethan remained where he was, his boots planted in the dust, his gaze steady, but there was something softer in it now, not relief, not triumph, just a quiet acknowledgement that the truth had finally begun to move on its own. Lila felt it too, that movement, slow but certain, like a current beneath still water, pulling her towards something she could no longer resist. She looked down for a brief second, at the ground between them, at the place where his holster lay untouched, and the meaning of it settled fully this time, not as surrender, but as trust, a trust that she would see what he refused to say. Her hands trembled slightly before stilling again, and when she lifted her head, there was no anger left in her expression, only the weight of what she had to carry forward. She did not step closer to Ethan, did not reach for him or for the truth as if it were something separate, because she understood now that they were already standing inside it. Behind her, the boy lowered his gaze, his part finished, his voice no longer needed, and the space he left behind closed slowly, quietly, like a door that would not open again. The wind passed through once more, softer this time, carrying with it the faint scent of dry earth and distant grass, and in that moment the town felt different. Not changed completely, but shifted enough that nothing could return to what it had been before. Lila swallowed, her voice steadying as she spoke again, not to accuse, not to defend, but to admit what had been there all along. And though the words were simple, they carried more weight than anything she had said before, because this time, she was not speaking against someone. She was speaking for the truth, and once spoken, it would not leave her side. The words settled into the air and did not move, not quickly, not cleanly, but with a weight that made every person in Red Hollow feel the shift, because Lila Greyhawk had not just spoken a name, she had accepted it, and in doing so she had turned the story away from the man who had stood silent and towards something far more difficult to hold. Her voice did not rise, did not demand. It stayed low, steady, carrying across the square like a truth that did not need force to be heard. And for the first time since the morning began, no one interrupted, no one questioned, because the certainty in her tone came from somewhere deeper than anger, deeper than accusation. The sheriff exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing as if a weight he had not fully understood was finally lifting, and his eyes moved back to Ethan Cole. But this time there was no suspicion in them, only a quiet recognition that the man had stood where few would have, unarmed, unmoving, and had let the truth find its own way forward. Ethan did not react to the change, did not claim it, did not even shift his stance, because whatever this moment was, it was not something he needed to own. Lila felt the eyes of the town on her now, not pressing, not judging, but waiting, and that waiting carried a different kind of pressure, one that asked her not just to speak, but to understand what she had spoken. She looked down again, at the dust between them, at the place where the holster still lay, and the meaning of it settled even deeper, because he had trusted her with something she had not earned yet, had believed she would see what he refused to explain. Her chest tightened at that realization, not with regret alone, but with the knowledge that she now stood at the center of a truth that would not leave her unchanged. Behind her, the boy had stepped back fully, disappearing into the edge of the crowd. His role finished, his burden passed on, and the space he left behind closed quietly, leaving only the echo of what he had said. A man near the saloon shifted his hat, another lowered his gaze. Small gestures that spoke of a town adjusting itself, piece by piece, to a story that no longer fit its first shape. The wind moved once more, softer now, carrying the faint sound of distant grass bending beyond the ridge, and in that quiet movement something settled, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to allow the moment to move forward. Lila lifted her head again, her eyes meeting Ethan's fully this time, and there was no accusation left there, only a question that had already begun to answer itself. Why he had chosen silence, why he had let her stand where she stood now, and though he did not speak, the answer was clear in the way he remained, steady, patient, as if he had known all along that the truth would not need him to carry it forever. She took a small step forward then, not toward the crowd, not toward the sheriff, but toward the space between them, and in that step was a shift. Quiet but undeniable, from accusation to responsibility, from certainty to understanding, and the town felt it, even if they could not name it yet, because the moment had changed, and nothing that followed would return to what it had been before. No one moved to stop her as Lila Greyhawk stepped into the space between herself and Ethan Cole, and that distance, no more than a few feet, felt wider than the whole stretch of land beyond Red Hollow, because it carried everything that had been said and everything that had not. Her boots pressed into the dust with a quiet certainty that had not been there before, not the sharp certainty of accusation, but the slower, heavier kind that came from understanding too late. Ethan watched her approach without shifting, his posture unchanged, but there was something in the way his gaze softened, not in relief, not in victory, just in acknowledgement, like he had expected this step long before she had taken it. The sheriff remained where he stood, his authority now reduced to observation, because whatever this moment required, it was no longer something he could command. The town held its breath again, but this time it was different, not tense, not waiting for conflict, but waiting for resolution, quiet and uncertain, like the moment before a truth settles into place. Lila stopped a few feet from Ethan and looked down at the ground between them, at the holster lying where he had left it, untouched, its leather worn smooth from years of use, its presence now heavier than it had ever been when it rested at his side. She bent slowly, her movements deliberate, and for a second her hand hovered above it, not reaching, not yet, as if she understood that touching it meant accepting something she could not put back. The wind moved lightly across the square, lifting a thin veil of dust that passed between them, and then was gone, leaving the moment clearer, sharper. When her fingers finally closed around the holster, it felt heavier than she expected, not because of its weight, but because of what it carried, the choice he had made to set it down, the trust he had placed in a truth he would not speak. She straightened again, holding it in both hands, and for a brief moment her eyes met his. And in that look there was no accusation, no defense, only a quiet recognition of what had passed between them without words. The crowd shifted slightly, some stepping back, others lowering their gaze, because they understood now that they were no longer witnesses to a conflict, but to something else, something quieter and harder to name. Lila drew in a breath, steady this time, and turned slightly, not away from Ethan, but enough to face the town. And when she spoke, her voice did not carry the sharp edge it once had. It carried weight, the kind that did not need to be forced to be heard. She said that the truth did not belong to one person, that it had been there from the beginning, waiting, and that she had chosen not to see it. The words moved through the crowd slowly, settling into place, reshaping what they had believed, not with resistance, but with acceptance. Ethan remained silent, his hands still at his sides, because there was nothing left for him to say, nothing he needed to claim. Lila looked back at him one last time, then down at the holster in her hands, and for a second it seemed like she might return it, might place it back into his grasp and let the moment end there. But her hands did not move, because she understood now that some things, once set down, were not meant to be picked up again so easily. And the choice of what to do next did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to her. The square did not erupt. It settled, and that quiet settling carried more weight than any outburst could have, because every person in Red Hollow understood that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Lila Greyhawk stood with the holster in her hands, the worn leather pressing into her palms like a reminder that choices left marks, even when no one spoke of them. And she could feel the eyes of the town no longer demanding answers, but measuring what she would do next. Ethan Cole remained where he was, his posture unchanged, but there was a faint easing in the set of his shoulders, not relief, not release, just the quiet acceptance of a man who no longer needed to stand against anything. The sheriff took a slow step forward, then stopped, as if realizing that stepping further would only break what had been carefully, painfully brought into the open. And so he stayed where he was, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Lila looked down at the holster again, tracing the edge of it with her thumb, and for a second she imagined placing it back into Ethan's hands, returning everything to the shape it had held before this morning. But that shape no longer existed, and she knew it. The wind moved gently through the square, carrying the faint creak of a sign hanging outside the saloon, a small sound that felt strangely clear now, like the world itself had grown quieter to make room for what remained. She lifted her head and turned slightly toward the town, her voice steady, not loud, but certain in a way it had not been before, and she said that what had been spoken could not be taken back, but it could be understood, and that understanding required more than pointing a finger. It required seeing what stood behind it. The words moved through the crowd slowly, not resisted, not challenged, but absorbed, because they no longer came from anger. They came from something deeper, something that asked each person listening to reconsider what they had believed without question. A man near the edge of the square removed his hat. Another shifted his stance. Small gestures that spoke of a town recalibrating itself, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Lila's gaze returned to Ethan, and for a moment neither of them moved, because there was nothing left to resolve between them, only something to acknowledge, something that had passed quietly, without witness until now. She took a single step closer, closing the distance that had once held accusation, and in that step there was no hesitation, only the weight of a decision she had already made. She held the holster out slightly, not offering it back, not yet, but not keeping it either, as if the act itself was not about possession, but about understanding what it represented. Ethan looked at it, then at her, and though he did not reach for it, there was something in his expression that shifted, not a change anyone else might notice, but enough to show that he understood the meaning of the gesture. Behind them, the town remained still, no longer pressing, no longer waiting for conflict, because the conflict had already passed, replaced by something quieter, something that required more from each of them than a simple answer. Lila drew in a slow breath, her hands steady now, and in that moment she realized that what she held was not just a holster, it was the weight of a choice, one that had been his before, and was now hers to carry, and whatever she did next would not just define him, it would define who she chose to become. Lila's hands did not move for a long second. The holster held between them like something that no longer belonged to either of them, and in that stillness the meaning of it became clear in a way words never could. The wind passed through again, softer now, carrying the dry scent of earth and distance, and with it came a quiet understanding that what had happened here would not be undone, only carried forward. Ethan Cole looked at the holster, then back at Lila Greyhawk, his gaze steady, not asking, not expecting, just present, as it had been from the beginning. And in that presence there was a kind of trust that made the moment heavier rather than easier. Lila felt it settle in her chest, that trust, not given lightly, not earned quickly, and she knew that whatever she did next would either honor it or break it in a way that could not be repaired. Behind them, the town remained still, no longer a crowd, but a collection of quiet witnesses, each one aware that they were seeing something that would not be spoken of loudly later, but would be remembered in the way people carried themselves afterward. The sheriff lowered his gaze briefly, then looked up again, his posture no longer rigid, because the need for authority had passed, replaced by something that required no badge to hold. Lila drew in a slow breath, feeling the weight of the holster in her hands, and then, without hesitation, she lowered it, not back into Ethan's grasp, but down toward the ground between them, returning it to the same dust where he had first placed it. And in that motion there was no rejection, no refusal, only a quiet acknowledgement that some choices were not meant to be reversed so easily. The leather touched the earth with a soft sound, barely heard, but it carried through the silence like a final note. Ethan watched the movement, and for a brief moment something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not disappointment, but understanding, because he saw what she was doing, not giving it back, not keeping it, but leaving it where it had first changed everything. Lila straightened slowly, her hands empty now, and for the first time since the morning began, there was nothing left for her to hold on to but the truth itself. She met his eyes again, and this time there was no question, no hesitation, only a quiet resolve that had not been there before, and though she did not speak, the meaning was clear in the way she stood, in the way she no longer turned away from what she had come to see. The town felt it, too, that quiet closing of something, not an ending, but a shift, a line drawn not in dust, but in understanding. A man near the saloon exhaled slowly, another stepped back, small movements that signaled the moment had passed beyond conflict into something else entirely. Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, then his gaze dropped briefly to the holster on the ground, and though he did not reach for it, there was a sense that he no longer needed to, because what it had represented had already been decided. Lila turned slightly then, not away from him, but toward the open space beyond the town, the same direction the wind had been moving all along, and in that turn there was no escape, no retreat, only the quiet acceptance of what came next, because the truth had found its place, and now it would follow her, not as a burden alone, but as something she had chosen to carry, and that choice, more than anything spoken before it, was what would remain. For a long moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already found its place, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, carrying the weight of what had changed in ways no one would ever quite put into words. Lila Greyhawk stood where she was, her hands empty, her shoulders steady, and for the first time since the morning began, she did not feel the need to explain herself, because the truth did not need her voice anymore. It only needed her to stand with it. Ethan Cole looked at her once more, not searching, not questioning, just seeing her as she was now. And in that quiet exchange, there was something that passed between them, something that did not belong to the town, something that did not need to be witnessed to be real. Then, without a word, he bent down slowly, his movements unhurried, and picked up the holster from the dust, not with urgency, not with ownership, but with the calm of a man who understood that what it represented had already been decided long before he touched it again. He brushed the dirt from it once, lightly, then held it at his side instead of fastening it back into place, as if even now, he was choosing what kind of man he would be when he walked away from this square. The sheriff exhaled quietly and stepped back, the line of authority dissolving into something simpler, something more human, and the town began to loosen around the edges, not dispersing quickly, not rushing to fill the silence with talk, but shifting slowly, like people who had just seen something they would carry with them whether they wanted to or not. A man lifted his hat in a small gesture of respect, another turned his gaze toward the horizon, and even the boy who had spoken earlier stood a little straighter, as if the weight he had carried had finally found its place. Lila watched Ethan for a moment longer, her eyes following the way he moved, the way he turned slightly toward the open road beyond the square, and for a second it seemed like she might call out, might say something to close the space between them, but she did not, because she understood now that some endings did not need words, they needed distance. Ethan took a step forward, then another, his boots pressing into the dust with a quiet certainty that matched the stillness he had held all along, and he did not look back, not because he could not, but because there was nothing left behind him that required it. Lila remained where she was, the wind brushing lightly against her face, carrying with it the same scent of earth and distance, and she let it settle, did not resist it, did not turn away from what it brought. Behind her, the town began to move again, slowly returning to itself, but not as it had been. Something subtle had shifted, something that would linger in the way people spoke, in the way they chose to listen before they judged. Lila lowered her gaze for a brief moment, then lifted it again toward the horizon where Ethan had gone, and though she did not follow, there was a quiet understanding in the way she stood, that the next time she faced a moment like this, she would not turn away from it. She would not choose the easier truth. The wind moved once more, then stilled, and in that stillness the story found its end, not in noise, not in triumph, but in something quieter, something that stayed long after the dust had settled, a reminder that out here, justice did not always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrived in silence, carried by those willing to stand still long enough to let it be seen.